Okay, so we've been talking about murder, or more correctly, I think the term is unlawful killing, and the commandment, not the sixth commandment in that regard. And we started looking last week at Numbers chapter 35, where we see, first of all, that a murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses. So without witnesses, a murderer shall not be put to death. And in fact, not only without witnesses, but if you've only got one witness, that's not enough. You've got to have at least two witnesses who testify to the murder. Now, if we think about this, and we talked quite a bit about this last week, but if you think about this, there's some real logic to this when you think about the requirement for what the expectation is for proving that someone was guilty of actually committing unlawful killing. It would be difficult, or it would be problematic, even if you had an unbiased witness. It could be very problematic for a single person to determine whether intent existed, especially if they were looking at things from a long way off, or maybe they were there but weren't paying a lot of attention or whatever. The more witnesses you have, the better chance you have of getting a complete or at least relatively accurate story about what actually happened, or understanding of what happened. We talked some last week about the problems with eyewitness testimony and the fact that in general, when you have multiple people that observe the same event, very rarely do you have consistency on all the details of that event. You're usually lucky if you can get the big picture and some major details that are consistent across all accounts. And it's not at all unusual to have a situation where if you ask 10 people who saw something happen, that you might get a story that emerges from 7 or 8 of them that's pretty consistent, and then you're going to have a couple of outliers that are just completely off.
And did you talk about the fact that if you have, let's just pick a more reasonable number, 3 witnesses, and they all told exactly the same story, that's a red flag.
Exactly, that's absolutely a red flag. When you have someone, and along those same lines, someone who is unreasonably certain of every detail of what they claim to have seen always made me nervous when I was a prosecutor. When I was putting somebody like that on as a witness, because, now, let me clarify. When I put police officers on as a witness, I rarely was concerned about that, because they are trained to pay attention and to record the things that they observe as quickly as possible after the incident that they're involved in. So I had, on one occasion, a situation where a guy had, he was drunk and probably high both. A great combination, by the way, if you're going to drive afterwards. But this police officer encountered him, initially encountered his girlfriend, who he kicked out of his truck, and was walking down the middle of the street near downtown Tucson, and he pulled up next to her he was in his uniform, but it was in his personal car because he'd been doing some kind of a function that he was doing, because he's technically off duty, but they're allowed to wear their uniforms for certain things. And so he had his gun belt next to him in the car, not on his waist the way he normally would. And he pulled up next to this woman and began to ask her, are you okay? Because she was walking along and she's obviously not real steady on her feet, and she was literally walking in the middle of the street at midnight. So he pulled up next to her and asked her if she was okay. She asked him if he could give her a ride, and he said, no, I only give rides to people for, one direction, down to the jail, so you don't want to ride with me, but you need to get off the middle of the road. You can't stay in the middle of the road. And she was obviously uncomprehending this. She asked him, can I get a ride from you? And it was about at that point that her whole boyfriend, who had kicked her out of the vehicle, his truck, when he pulled over to the side of the road, recognized that there was this man he didn't know talking to his girlfriend late at night. So he got out of his truck and headed towards the police officer and pulled a knife out on it as he got closer to the police officer. At which point the police officer, and of course you read his account and it's very dry, I drew my service weapon from, in reality he told me later on that this guy was like feet from him with the knife, and he's scrambling for his gun, and manages to pull out. The guy realizes that he's outgunned, he's brought a knife to a gunfight, drops the knife and runs back to his truck and drives off. So the police officer calls a bunch of, calls for backup basically, because he's not even really on duty. And because it's a police officer that somebody's pulled a knife on, half of the Tucson Police Department that was on duty at the time all headed, and also it's midnight, so they don't have anything else to do anyway for the most part, they all headed downtown. And so there's like 8 or 9 police cars that are chasing, well actually, they all get downtown and the guy's nowhere to be seen, of course, because he drove off, a minute and a half ago. But the moron comes and pulls up to the top of the street to see what's happened. So he shows back up again, at which point the first police officer goes, that's him! And 7 police cars chase after this guy. And in the lead police car was a rookie who was actually doing his initial tour with a supervisory officer next to it. And so the rookie is driving the car, and the supervising officer made the most detailed list of traffic infractions I've ever received. You know, he ran through this stop sign, he turned left without signaling, he ran through that stop sign, he sped through this light, he was exceeding the speed limit, and it was like this just unbelievable level of detail of all the different traffic infractions that this guy committed while being pursued by half of the Tucson police force. So occasionally you do get, and in my job as an officer, or as a prosecutor rather, you do occasionally get very detailed reports, particularly from police officers. But when you're talking about civilian witnesses, if civilian witnesses come in and they have very detailed recollections to the point where they're always saying, I'm absolutely certain about this, and I'm certain about this, you start getting a little bit nervous, because most people aren't like that. You know, sometimes there are some people like that, and if you've been in certain kinds of professions, maybe you're like that, but most people just aren't. And so when you have that kind of a thing, you get kind of worried about it. So one of the things we have to be really careful about with witness testimony is the possibility, number one, of mistake, and number two, of intentional falsehood, that someone is intentionally making something up. And so there's a lot of different ways that witness bias can come in, and sometimes it's not bias in the sense of, you know, I decided he was black and so I said it's a black guy. Sometimes it's bias in the sense of, after the fact, this is the person that keeps showing up on the news as the report of the person who committed the offense, and so we start remembering that as being the person that did it, even though that's not really the case, because our minds tend to do that. We tend to gather information even after the fact to try to make sense out of events that have happened. So eyewitness testimony can be problematic, but in the absence of any other really good form of evidence gathering, which they lacked back then, it's the only thing you've really got. But at least there's this provision here that says you need at least two. You can't do it with just one person. So Barbara, and then I'll go to Jerry.
I think it's interesting, working in banks, all the years I did, they always are going over robbery and things like that that you were supposed to do, or if you get a phone call, or, you know, terrorist or something, or you don't want to be saying they got your kids or something like that. They go over all these procedures that you're supposed to do. And one of the very things they tell you is if you were robbed, or if you're, you know, in the bank during a robbery, you are not supposed to talk to anybody afterwards. You're not supposed to talk to anybody except the police and stuff. You're not supposed to talk among yourselves, because they don't want you gathering information from this person or something they saw. They want just your testimony without any interference from anybody else. And so they're really strict about that stuff, because they do not want, you know, everybody getting bits of information from everybody else and combining it.
Yeah, and that's the danger, is that, you know, especially, and there's always the additional risk that if you have somebody on the inside who is part of the crime, that they can pollute the information pool as well. So you have to be very careful about that. And then the other side to it is, you think about, we have in our society, we've added put certain systems in place, like the one you're talking about, where even though someone is not a police officer, you receive certain kinds of training because of the kind of job that you're in. And you think about, for example, convenience stores. Convenience stores have those interesting things on the door as you walk in and out that actually, you know, show how tall somebody is, which makes it. I've never really noticed that at the bank. I'll have to pay attention the next time in there. But they're designed to basically make it really easy for someone who works there to take a look as someone's leaving the store to get a pretty good sense of what their height is without having to estimate or do all that different kind of stuff. And so we've built in procedures like that for certain kinds of positions. But the average person, without any training and without any experience, is typically not able to really make a particularly, when it's a stressful, you know, kind of exciting or dangerous kind of situation, your adrenaline kicks in, your observation skills tend to go down, and you just have a hard time getting really good information. And so that's why the more people you can talk to, the better your overall understanding of the event is likely to be. Likely.
Yeah. We had 2 robberies in
the goodness.
I worked at, and the one time I was the only one that saw this person without their glasses. They actually put sunglasses on going into the bank, and I was going over to get the mail because I was the secretary there. So I was going over to the mailbox. So I was coming out of the bank, said hi to this person. She put glasses on and then went into the bank, and sunglasses on. And I'm, it's just kind of like a little strange, putting them on when you're going in instead of taking them off. But yeah, when I came back, the doors were locked, and
Interesting.
My first clue that, yeah, we've been robbed.
Something has
So,
happened. Interesting. Now that is interesting. All right, Jerry, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say I witnessed an assault, and I came home and wrote it up.
Right.
What I had seen, I wrote the whole thing up. And I don't think the police officer, when he showed up to talk to me, I don't think he wanted that. I think he wanted to interview me for some reason or another. But he took the paper and left. But
Yeah. Well, and Mark could probably speak to this better than I can in some respects, but we generally, when you're interviewing a witness, you want their kind of candid recollection, as opposed to, the fear is always if they wrote something down, they had time to think through and reword it and, you know, and fix it up, and that may have degraded the actual,
that's probably,
you know, the actual information. But that's not always, the thing is, the irony, of course, is that police officers, as soon as they finish some kind of a call, if it's a DUI or if it's a, you know, assault or whatever it is they respond to, is more often than not, they will pull off into a parking lot somewhere. We always, you know, laugh and say police officers parked in a parking lot. Why are they parking? Or why aren't they out doing something? Well, almost always what they're doing is they have actually, depending on the system that they've got, they're either using their phones or their, these days, their body cameras, or they're calling into a number that you call into as an officer, and you then give a detailed recounting of what you've done, and it's then transcribed and actually turned into a report. So police officers are trained to record their observations as soon as possible in order to get it as done as well as possible. But they're also trained in how to make those observations, so they have an advantage in terms of, you know, doing that correctly. So anyway, the point of all this is that we're in an environment where we don't have forensics in particular. We are so used to the value and the validity of forensics in our society. And I'm not just talking about, you know, DNA or fingerprints and stuff like that. I'm talking about in an accident, for example. There is a tremendous amount of reconstruction of what actually happened that you can do from skid marks and impacts and angles. And I mean, because collisions are just physics. And one thing about physics is that physics is something that if you know the numbers, you can reconstruct what happened, generally speaking. And so forensics is a lot more than just the things that we sometimes think about, the CSI kinds of stuff. A lot of it is just being able to examine a scene and make sense out of what happened from the scene. But those skills and those technologies and those concepts didn't exist at this time. And so what you're primarily left with is witnesses. And that means that if there are witnesses around, then there is the risk that somebody's going to get away with murder, you know. But at the same time, how else are you going to do it, you know? So it says at least two witnesses. So you got to have two witnesses. But notice the other aspect of this, which is that there's two parts of this command. The murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of two or more witnesses. So the two or more witnesses is part of it, but he also says you can't take a ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. He shall surely be put to death. So the idea that we have here is you can't buy your way out of a murder charge just because you've got money. And historically, if you look at history in all the way through at least the Middle Ages into the age of exploration and that area, it was not uncommon if you had enough money to be able to pay your way out. A lot of times with the agreement of the family, or at least the agreement of the family, because they realized that if they didn't agree to take the money, the person was probably going to get off scot-free at a trial anyway. And so paying money in exchange for the death of someone was not all that uncommon. And in our society today, it's not so much about paying money for, you know, to compensate the family. It's more about paying money to get a really, really good attorney and have a much more favorable trial than you might have if you didn't have a lot of money. And so money has become, has long been a major factor in the level of justice that somebody receives. But God says that's not how it's supposed to be under His law. If you're guilty of murder, then you get put to death. You can't pay for it, you can't avoid it. And along the same lines, He also says, you shall not take a ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge. In other words, somebody who has fled there and been adjudged not guilty, he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. In other words, you can't reduce the sentence. And this is where, once again, we see this, and a couple of you commented on this or responded when I asked about this. This is where it makes it abundantly clear, if you hadn't seen it already, that the point of you having to stay in the city of refuge is that there has to be consequences. I think Ken in particular was willing to articulate that there have to be consequences, even if it's an accidental thing, even if it is manslaughter or perhaps even something less than that. You took somebody's life. You caused the death of another person, and there have to be consequences for that. And so the way the system is set up might seem arbitrary because the high priest might die next month or he might die in 10 years. But again, because of the Israelite mindset that says everything happens because God wants it to, that's not a problem, because that means that the death happened when it was supposed to, so that you would go back home when you were supposed to. But one thing you can't do is pay your way out of that. What would happen if it became apparent that you could buy your way out of the city of refuge and go back home early? What would that do to the system of justice?
It would be crooked.
It would be crooked, okay? That is definitely true. How would it affect the way that people reacted to the system of justice?
I think with anger and say that is not justice.
Okay.
Like we see today sometimes too, where you have to say, that's not justice done, you know, because,
Yeah.
some can buy their way out with the top lawyer they have, whatever, you know.
Now, and consider also that we're talking about a system in which vigilantism is not only encouraged or allowed, but codified in the form of the avenger of blood. So if you have a system in which vigilantism, in which, doing it yourself is built into the system, and somebody starts to perceive that, and a lot of people, system-wide, begin to perceive that the system is unfair, the result is almost certainly even more vigilantism. Even more people taking the law into their hands, or the avenger of blood who feels like the money that paid wasn't sufficient, or maybe the next person in line taking the law into their hands. And then you start getting into, well, now are they a murderer, and what does that mean? And so the problem you have if you don't follow the rules is that people will begin to distrust the system, and they will begin to ignore the system and make up their own rules. Because if you're not following the rules, why should I follow the rules? Okay.
And distrusting the system is kind of where I was going to go, is that if you start letting it happen with one penalty, then it begins to undermine people's confidence and embolden those who want to violate the system. Hey, I can get off with anything.
Right. And that's where the ultimate end of this is the sense that there's no, I'm not really bound by the rules. I can do whatever I want to. Barbara?
The main thing is God says that defiles the land if.
Yes, you're a page ahead of us here, but
Yeah.
we'll go to that right now, actually. So,
he says, if you don't do this, it's, going against me and
Yeah.
the land.
and this gets us to that last point here. So let's read this real quick. You shall not, so you shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. So we have this concept that God explains of innocent blood. He talked about all the way back in Genesis. We looked at that you don't shed man's blood. And if you do shed man's blood, then you are creating pollution, a blood pollution. And this speaks once again to the value and importance of blood. And this is a bigger picture issue even than murder is, because the scriptures make it clear that blood sacrifice is also tied into the same set of concepts. And so when you have innocent blood that's shed, it pollutes the land, and he says there's no expiation. What does expiation mean?
Justifiable remedy.
Justifiable remedy, okay. The word we would probably use is atonement. Is probably the easiest term we have. You can't fix it, is probably, if you want to put it in a really simple term, you can't fix it. You've made a mess and you can't clean it up. It's like a Superfund site. Most of
Mine
you know what a
says,
Superfund site
no
is.
sacrifice is acceptable.
Okay, yeah, and that's really important. And this actually gets us to that where I think that this becomes really relevant when it comes to Christ, because there's no way to fix blood debt and blood pollution. And sin pollutes our blood. And so this is where this idea of the shedding of blood becomes necessary. So our sin has the effect of polluting our blood. And once we've done that, there isn't any sacrifice. There's no fixing it using anything except our own blood, except for one thing, and that was the blood of Christ. And so we actually see some of the principles of Christ's sacrifice being foreshadowed here in this discussion of blood and the sacrifice for blood.
It seems to me too that when you had the murder or whatever it was, they called the congregation together. That for what would be the trial per se, and then the judges would decide. So my point is, again, they make an example because they don't want this behavior to spread.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to, and what's interesting is, we don't actually see a lot of examples of, well, let me rephrase that. We see a relatively high number of examples of murder relative to the number of pages in the Bible in the Old Testament. But if those are the specific examples and they are the exception, then it would suggest that murder actually is fairly rare among the Israelites. What I mean by that is, if you're only telling the important or exciting parts, and you only talk about murder a few times, that probably means there weren't a whole lot of murders being committed. Now, whether that's true or not is less clear, and certainly when we look, for example, in the book of Judges, it's very lawless, and there's a lot of murder and a lot of things that are being done. But later, particularly as we get into some of the later the books of Samuel and Kings, when a king or either engages in murder or allows it to go on, that's kind of called out as kind of a big deal. So it suggests that this particular principle, at least, was followed to at least some degree, at least, even during some of the less noble times in Israel's history, because of the importance of keeping murder out of control or under control. And that's something that any rational government wants to have happen. You don't want murder to just run rampant, because that of all the things that you can do, that's the one that creates the most chaos, basically. So God says, though, that there's an underlying reason here. It's not just, murder is bad. It's not just, somebody committed a crime. It is a pollution of the land that can only be fixed by shedding the murderer's blood. That is the offset for somebody who commits murder. And then the last thing he says, which is something we don't always talk about, is that he notes that he says, I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. I live here, which is really interesting, because while God is everywhere and is in all, he's all places at all times, he specifically calls out that he lives and dwells in the midst of the sons of Israel, that they are his people. And so there is something special about his presence there. Not because he is any less capable of acting anywhere besides Israel, as many of the peoples around Israel believed that their gods were, that they were limited geographically to whatever places they had conquered, but because he is choosing to favor them and choosing to have a special relationship with them, which is very, very relevant to our relationship with God, because he dwells in us, or the Holy Spirit dwells in us. And he is there when we do everything that we do, good or bad. And Jesus talks about this idea that, when you say, you hate your brother, or when you call your brother a fool, that you are thinking the kinds of thoughts that are the equivalent of murder. And the Holy Spirit is there, listening to that and observing them. And so it changes, or it should change, the way that we look at how we think about others and how we talk about others, when we recognize that God is living in the midst of us as well, indwelling us through the Holy Spirit on a constant basis. And it's not like he just runs off whenever we think that stuff. He's still there, dwelling in us and perceiving that. And that is a kind of a embarrassing thing at best, I suppose, if we think about it in those terms. Jerry, you had your hand up.
I was just thinking there's another parallel to this in Leviticus, I'm sure, where he talks about the need for latrines, because God is walking around the area of the 2 million people that are there.
That one I don't remember.
He talks about dwelling in the land with them.
Yeah, and he talks about that on a number of different occasions in pragmatic and also more philosophical ways. So, okay, so let's move on here. Okay, so we've talked about the difference between killing in the broadest definition and murder in the tightest definition. In the middle of that, the unlawful killing that is the subject of the commandment, you shall not kill unlawfully. So the question for us today that probably comes up the most often for people who have questions or who are curious about the perspectives of Christians is what does that mean for things like war and self-defense? Those are the two big areas that you see come up. And certainly historically there have been Christians who refuse to take any sort of violent action, whether it's entire organizations like the Quakers, or whether it's individual Christians who have chosen to, rather than to stand up and fight or fight back, they have simply been passive in the face of aggression. And there are some like the Quakers and others who are pacifists who will not fight in wars and who are, generally speaking, granted conscientious objector status as a result of that. And again, while entire religious orders like the Quakers generally qualify for that, individual Christians have also taken that position from time to time. And depending on their history and whether they're able to show a consistent practice of that belief, they may also be accorded conscientious objector status, at least in this country. Not all countries are quite as permissive in that regard. But the question for us is one of, is it okay or is it not okay? That's the question that kind of comes up here. I got two hands already, so let me start with Sylvia and then I'll go to Ken.
It is lawful because God said that the man who is the head of the household is to protect his family. Anyway, he needs to.
So I would need you to give me a scriptural citation for
So
that.
if you get robbed or somebody comes into your house and wants to do violent towards your family, you are supposed to shoot them.
I'm certain you can't find a scriptural citation for that, because they definitely didn't have guns at the time. So
No, but-
it's a little bit more complicated than that. I would agree with your principle. The problem is that I have yet to find a scripture that specifically says it quite like that, which would make it much easier for us. And so we have to sort of pull in some other things to come to a conclusion about this. But Ken, you had your hand
Well,
up.
as far as the war, that's perhaps a little easier. I think Romans 13 demonstrates or says that God empowers governments to wield the sword in his place. And so to me, I've always looked at that if a government is called into a situation of war and you are called into service in that government, then you're not violating God's command.
Yes, and I think when it comes to war, it's a much easier, as you said, a much easier conversation to have. Now, I don't say that to say that somebody who genuinely is a pacifist and who believes in nonviolence should be forced to go to war because of that. Paul talks about our conscience, and I think that the logic that he uses that talks about one who eats doesn't look down on the one who doesn't eat, one who doesn't eat doesn't look down on the one who does eat, could very easily transpose over to that particular situation. The one who goes out to fight doesn't look down on the one who doesn't, and vice versa. So I think when we talk about war, the only place where that gets particularly tricky is when you're talking about the kinds of governments that we sometimes encounter who do some very, very evil things in war. And I think there we have a situation where certainly if we are called on to do something in war that is evil, then we have an obligation to say, no, we're not going to do that. And I don't mean evil in the sense of I've got to kill the guy on the other side because that's part of war. I mean things that are obviously wrong, operating concentration camps that are, gassing civilians or engaging in wholesale massacres. One of the stories that I've talked about with my students in the Vietnam War is the My Lai massacre. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of My Lai, but it was a village in Vietnam midway through the war. American soldiers had come to realize that they really had no meaningful way to differentiate between the Viet Cong, who were the South Vietnamese rebellion, and the populace of South Vietnam, because the Viet Cong would dress as commoners. They would have women and children carry bombs. It was basically functionally impossible to tell who was your friend and who was your enemy, and that led to a tremendous amount of frustration. On top of that, when they would engage the Viet Cong would engage in guerrilla tactics where they would attack and cause some harm, and then they would just disappear. And so it became incredibly frustrating to be a soldier for America in Vietnam, because your enemy was never willing to stand around and fight the way that the enemies had been willing to do in World War II and even in the Korean War. And so it was very frustrating, and over time, this led to a mindset among American soldiers, at least some American soldiers, that everybody was the enemy. And eventually this culminated in a series of different massacres, but probably the worst of all of them, or at least the most well recorded of all of them, was the My Lai massacre that took place like I said, about midway through the war. What basically happened was that soldiers who had been sent in to pacify a village that was believed to have some Viet Cong resistance in it, essentially sort of lost control and lost the ability to differentiate and began just killing everybody. And doing it quite brutally, as well as sexually assaulting women, and it was just completely out of control. And one of the most heroic characters in the Vietnam War, one of the most heroic soldiers, was a helicopter pilot, along with the crew of his helicopter, who was flying over this and saw what was happening, and initially was ordered to continue on, and they were just taking care of the village that needed to be done, and ultimately decided not to follow that order, turned his helicopter back around and landed it between armed soldiers, armed American soldiers with M16 rifles, and civilians that they were getting ready to kill, and ordered his door crew to basically open fire on them if they wouldn't stop coming. And eventually the soldiers stopped, and that was the beginning point that pushed the commanders of that unit to step in and stop what was going on. But it takes a lot of courage in a situation like that, when you are institutionally conditioned to obey what you've been told to do, and you are also part of a mindset that has become incredibly frustrated or angry or whatever else it is, to be able to set that aside and say, this is the wrong thing to do, and I'm not going to participate in this. And so there is an obligation that exists, and this is not just a matter of moral law, of God's law. The courts have held consistently that the Nuremberg defense, that I was only following orders, is not a valid defense against war crimes, against doing things that you know you shouldn't do. And that even your commanding officers cannot legally give you an order that would constitute a war crime. And if you receive such an order, you are obligated to refuse that order. And like I said, not an easy thing to do, but as Christians, it hopefully would be a little bit easier for us, because we are conditioned on another level to do what's right, even in the face of somebody telling us to do something different. But it still is not an easy thing to do. So when it comes to war, though, in general, and accepting that particular situation, and fortunately for most of America's history, we have certainly at least not had a government that was advocating for those kinds of atrocities and war crimes, even if they sometimes turned a blind eye to them. But many other Christians throughout the world have had to deal with much more difficult questions. If you live in Germany in the 1930s, you're going to have some really tough questions if you end up being drafted into service. So war, though, is a situation where we don't necessarily have to have a command from God saying, you go to war, to know that we should follow the commands or the orders of our government, unless it is something that it would constitute a war crime. The more complicated question is what happens in the situation of self-defense, which for all of us in here, even me at this point, is the more relevant question than what happens if you go out sent off to war, because I don't think any of us are really at serious risk of being sent off to war at this point. You know, we all have at least one check box on our selective service cards in terms of our age that really kind of exempts us at this point. So war is one thing. Self-defense is a different thing, because in a situation of self-defense, it's not the government saying, go do this. It's me saying, this is an appropriate situation for me to use violence, either in response to violence or to prevent violence from happening. And that can certainly seem, on the face of it, to run up against some of these commands against violence, against murder, and what Jesus certainly talks about when he talks about turning the other cheek and some of those things. So let's take a look at self-defense in the scriptures. We're only going to get partway through this, but I want to take a look at Nehemiah chapter 4. Nehemiah chapter 4 is an interesting situation, because you have the Israelites have returned to the land of Israel after being in captivity for many years in Babylon, later Persia. They have begun to repair the walls of Jerusalem in order to make it habitable again. And as you might imagine, the people living around there who are not friends of the Jews are not particularly enthusiastic about this. And so there's a couple of guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, that are kind of leading the opposition to this. But also there are Arabs and Ammonites and Ashdodites, all who live in that area. And they hear that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem has continued. This is in the context of that they had managed to get the king of Persia to stop it temporarily, but Nehemiah got it restarted, and they're mad, and so they're saying that the breaches are beginning to close, and they're very angry. And they conspired to come together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause a disturbance in it. But we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. Our enemies said, they will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to their work. And when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against us from every place you may turn, then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places. And I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. From that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates, and the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried the burdens took their load with one hand doing the work and the other hand holding a weapon. And as for the builders, each wore his sword girded at his side as he built. With the trumpeter, while the trumpeter stood near me, I said to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive. We are separated on the wall far from one another. At whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Sorry for the footnote thing in there. Rally to us there, our God will fight for us. So what's interesting here is that you don't have an organized nation even, but what you do have is a very sort of basic concept of organized self-defense, which is the Israelites recognizing that they can be attacked at any moment by a force that could be quite lethal, have now prepared themselves for that possibility. They're armed, they are working in shifts where one person is doing the physical work and one person is guarding, and they are basically prepared to use violence to repel violence. And so we do see examples of self-defense in the Old Testament in particular. It's interesting, in modern Israel, after the initial, the modern state of Israel was created, only a few years after that was created, a number of Arab nations attacked Israel simultaneously and very nearly overran them because Israel was not prepared for that. They were not expecting that. From that point, and in particular, they attacked them, I want to say, I can't remember if it was on a Sabbath or it was actually on one of their holy days. But in either event, the soldiers who would normally have been tasked with guarding and doing, defense duties, most of them were unarmed and they were just, in synagogues and different places like that. And when the attack came, they were woefully unprepared for it. Well, ever since then, on their holy days and on their Sabbaths, the Israeli Defense Forces who are on duty go to Sabbath with their guns slung over their back, ready for those kinds of things to happen. In spite of that, this more recent terrorist attack still took them substantially by surprise. So the reality is that modern warfare gets more complicated. But the point is that self-defense is something that is contemplated by the Bible in situations where the righteous are under threat by the unrighteous. And I think that that's a really important thing that we need to consider when we talk about self-defense. And it's a basic concept. If you take a self-defense course, if you take a concealed carry course, that is drilled into you, which is if you start the fight, you can't call it self-defense. And I don't mean if you start the fight because somebody's rushing at you and you're the first one to throw a punch. I don't mean that. I mean, if you're the one who gets everything rolling, you're the agitator, you create the situation, and then you try to claim self-defense, that's not self-defense anymore. That's just you starting something and finishing it all at the same time. So self-defense begins with the presumption that you are the righteous in that situation. I don't mean that you're morally better than the other person, I just mean that you have not contributed to in any significant way or helped to cause the situation that leads to the need for self-defense. You take that component out of it, self-defense gets a lot harder under American law, and it definitely gets a lot harder under biblical law.
I think it's interesting, we're starting to have to do that in our country today because churches are getting attacked and there are,
Yes.
we have security people in these larger churches a lot of times that are there every Sunday for
Yes.
that purpose, to protect the people that are there to worship and from the people that are coming in and just going up and shooting them.
And that was actually the situation, as I read the news reports. Now, they didn't specifically say that, but I also think that it's because they were asked not to. But the news reports of this shooting at Joel Osteen's church this past week, it was just this past week, I believe.
Yeah, it was Sunday.
Okay, so it was last Sunday. So the indication there, what they stated there was the two individuals who ultimately stopped the shooter one was an off-duty and the other one was a retired, I believe, law enforcement. And the way it read, it didn't explicitly say it, but I'm fairly confident that those were probably people who were employed as security personnel, maybe not necessarily in uniform, but in a plainclothes capacity, because in most larger churches now, Central Christian and some of those ones, every single location has generally got at least a few undercover plainclothes security, and sometimes even some active, openly uniformed security as well, because of those threats. And really, it would be a mistake to think that those threats are focused on churches because of them being churches, any more than thinking that people are attacking schools because they hate children specifically, although some of the people do have grudges or whatever. The reality is that what is happening in this age of mass shooting is people are looking for large groups of people, that because it's a target-rich environment, and in particular they tend to focus on targets that they know have less likelihood of defending themselves. So schoolers, they are the ideal one because, number one, most of your targets there are children who are capable of defending themselves anyway, and number two, because schools are one of the few places in America where you can be absolutely certain that anybody who follows the law is not going to be armed. There's almost no place else in America that's quite as convenient and thoughtful about that as schools are in terms of providing that kind of an environment. But churches are close behind, or have been historically close behind it, because of that assumption that people have that everybody who goes to church is a pacifist, which is a very, very inaccurate assumption, as has been proved on several different occasions with these kinds of situations. But because large groups of people gather in churches, it is important for churches to be mindful of that reality, that people are looking for opportunities to find easy targets. And so whenever you're at a large gathering, you just have to be conscious of the fact that you are inherently part of something that is an attractive target for somebody who wants to do violence. And that is an unfortunate reality of our situation. But ironically, it's one of the few things that has nothing to do with bias against the church specifically. It's simply an injection of evil from Satan into the way our world works right now. And it's pretty unilateral or universal in terms of what it's focused on. Sylvia?
Well, I think it is the hate that Satan has and goes through the people. When I still was in the synagogue, and it was a big one in Phoenix, we had always police present on every Shabbat. And high holy days, there were probably a dozen there, and they even did check the cars that went through there. And they checked even us, there were members. And they did once in a while, one with a gun, you know, and so you had to do that because of the hate of the Jews. But now the hate comes against the Christians too.
That's
so true. Now they have to, in big churches probably, they have to have some kind of security.
Right. And I won't get to Stephen just saying, but one thing I want to be clear about is what we actually are seeing today when it comes to religious shootings. If there is a religious bias in there, it's almost always targeted against some religious group. So it's not just, you're right, it's not just the Jews, although they have historically been the most common targets. It is also against, in some cases against Christians specifically, in some cases against Muslims in specific, and in some cases it's against racial subgroups. So black churches have historically had much higher levels of violence directed towards them than white churches did. So there is an element of racism and bias against churches that is a factor in some of these things, just as in the case of some of the school shootings, it's somebody who, you know, got kicked out or, you know, something like that. But by and large, many of these cases that we're seeing are just people who are picking the place where there's the most targets. And it's not so much that they've developed a deep hatred of one group or another, it's that they dressed up what they're doing in that along the way. Or they've gone to the gay nightclub because they've decided they hate gay people, and the way to fix that is to shoot them. So the real problem here isn't so much that people, I mean, it is a problem, hate is a problem. Jesus talks about that, and we're seeing what happens when hate is armed in our society. But the real problem isn't so much how people feel about stuff, it's the fact that now we've reached a point where in our culture, the normal response to that is, let's go get a gun and take care of it, you know? And that's where things start to really fall apart. Steve, one last thought here.
Okay, so it'll be a good one.
All right.
I believe in self-defense because I think we're almost obligated to do it. The reason that we do self-defense, or when we step into a situation, is for the purpose of saving lives. And so when you have someone shooting up a parade, or shooting up a church, or shooting up, or even coming into your own home, you're trying to save your own life or others. And in a school situation, I think it's totally a courageous Christian act to step in and try and stop the situation. And there is a scripture about who will die for, you know, this person or that, but, you know, are you willing to die for a stranger?
Yeah.
And so we need to be prepared to defend and help each other.
And we're going to talk a lot more about that next week, as well as talking a little bit about the laws in Arizona that are not simply addressed as directed at self-defense, but also, as Steve has sort of previewed for us, the defense of others. But that's for next week, because we need to break up now and take a little break before our worship begins. So thank you guys for being here.